They thought they were going to be we thought they were going to be angry with us. What we found, which was kind of amazing, was that, and I'll ask you about this, Dr. Bobby, when you were trained as a therapist, did someone teach you specifically how to use personality? And I don't mean personality disorder, how to use personality in the process of psychotherapy?
No, absolutely not. And
I've asked
yeah.
now hundreds and hundreds of therapists, and
Hmm.
it's usually, 99% or more
Yeah.
say they've never been told anything about how to work with personality in therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're writing the book, I was kind of shocked about this.
As a therapist, you probably have so many clients who are interested in working on their attachment styles. They've become aware that maybe they didn't get all their needs met as a kid and it's impacting their relationships. And now they're coming to you for help with that. Well, today on this episode of Love, Happiness, and Success for Therapists, I am interviewing Dr. Daniel Siegel, who you probably know is such an authority in the field of the science of attachment, in childhood development. And he's here today to share with you some of his newer work and taking into consideration personalities, temperaments, and attachment styles in order to create really positive outcomes. So, Dr. Dan Siegel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa.
So I know that all the therapists listening to us right now are probably very familiar with your work already. I mean, many of your books were standard issue in counseling school. You spent years teaching psychiatry at UCLA. But for any of my listeners who may not be fully familiar with your work, give them just a quick synopsis of who you are and what you've done.
Well, I, like you, am a therapist, and I'm a part of our wonderful field of mental health,
Mm.
and the mental health disciplines, have been really uh, a focus of mine as an educator for many years. So I'm the founder of a series of books for therapists called the Norton Professional Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology. And so I've edited over 100 textbooks
Have
for the
you?
field of mental health.
Wow.
So there's a lot to read. I've written a couple of those books, but the books I write are sometimes for therapists, sometimes for parents, sometimes for the general public. And, you know, the exciting thing is that you can apply all of these principles of interpersonal neurobiology to how people grow in a number of different settings. So for us as therapists, what I was really interested in doing was not creating another, modality of how to do therapy, but rather a framework of understanding reality that could be used to inform, any form of therapy. And so whatever discipline you might be coming from, whatever modality you may have been trained in, interpersonal neurobiology provides a foundation that would be useful to you to prepare your mind for all the wonderful and sometimes challenging interactions we have and the interventions we can provide for our clients, for our
Mhm.
patients.
Yeah, absolutely. We could go into so many different directions with this, but you have been working more recently on some different ideas that go into attachment theory and how people are impacted by their early life experiences and how that can sometimes disrupt their ability to create easy, stable, enduring attachment bonds. And this is very much in the zeitgeist these days. It seems to me, as a therapist in recent years, the general public has gotten the memo that there are different attachment styles, and people are talking about it on TikTok and self diagnosing what their attachment issues might be. But I think that there isn't always a easy way of helping people, particularly if they've had a lot of adverse childhood experiences. And so I know that you and your colleagues have been working on a very different way of understanding not just attachment styles, but in a much more nuanced way. Can you just talk a little bit about where your research has taken you?
Yeah, well, I was trained as an attachment researcher.
Mm-hmm.
in the 1980s and early 90s. And that really informed my therapy. And then I got invited to go to a dive into what the organizers of a workshop said was a dive into temperament.
Mm.
And it turned out it was an Enneagram of personality workshop that went over a week long period.
Wow.
And I was very doubtful of whether this was going to have any value or not. The Enneagram of personality is not based on science. So
Hmm.
I was very dubious of
Yeah.
what its utility would be, but I was blown away by actually how the patterns of personality that were revealed in this workshop seemed to have some kind of deep merit to them.
Right.
So there were four other people gathered at that workshop. There were about 50 of us there that were trained in science.
Mm.
One was the leader, David Daniels, who had started this program called the Narrative Enneagram in Menlo Park with Helen Palmer, one of the early writers about the Enneagram. And then there was David's daughter, Denise Daniels, who had written one of the most referred to papers on the genetics of personality with Robert Plomin, her research advisor. And then her colleague, Laura Baker, who is a professor of the genetics of personality at USC, University of Southern California, and Jack Killen, who at that time was a deputy medical director of the Complementary and Alternative Medicine Division of the National Institute of Health.
Hmm.
Together, the five of us got together for many, many years intermittently and said there must be a developmental neuroscience view
Mm.
of this Enneagram that, though it hasn't been described before, probably underlies the strength of what we're seeing in these nine fundamental different ways people seem to be. There was no controlled research on that, but it was just an impression that the
Yeah.
Enneagram of personality, which I'll just call the Enneagram,
Right.
seemed to reveal.
Yeah,
And
and
so,
may I just pause you just for 1 second, just in the
of
event that some of our listeners have not been exposed to the Enneagram, what it is. I'm just finding this so incredibly fascinating. So, as therapists or psychologists, we are trained on personality assessments, batteries, all kinds of different things. I myself was trained to test, interpret Rorschach tests. I mean, like we can go in a lot of different directions. But as a clinician going into practice, the Enneagram personality test is a very simple, questionnaire type thing that will spit out a report with your top personality type. And I encountered this many years ago, but like you, Dr. Siegel, I think I interpreted this as, what is this? Is this like pop psychology? Like where are the psychometrics? Like what is this based on? And there wasn't a ton of stuff. And at the same time, though, I have found it to be a very useful tool for understanding my own personalities of my clients, and it has become something that I've used in my practice quite regularly, because the reports give people insight into their motivations, into their response styles, but also what I found so useful is create some awareness of what does your personality look like when you are at your healthiest and best versus what does your personality look like during times of stress when you're not doing very well. And I'm finding it so fascinating that you are, I mean, are such a respected academic and have done so much research that you encountered this Enneagram system and were like, huh, what is that? And found it to be so useful. And thank you for giving me the opportunity just to explain it for a second in the event that some of our listeners haven't been exposed to that previously. So
no, thank
yeah,
you.
yeah,
Thank
it's
you. And
good
that's a
stuff.
beautiful summary.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just would
Hmm.
say to be, for all of us, to be very careful that the questionnaires out there that are asking like surface questions about the
Hmm.
Enneagram look like they aren't very reliable.
Yeah.
So this is what was an initial turnoff to my colleagues and to me,
Hmm.
even though one of us made one of the most referred to questionnaires that exist, David Daniels, and a deeper dive seems to bring out this ability to go deep into exactly what you're saying, the
Yeah.
motivations that are beneath your behaviors, the
Hmm.
motivations that are beneath even your emotional reactions to things, the motivations that are beneath even where you pay attention.
Mm.
So that's what we started focusing on. And we tried out different models. We use the broad framework of interpersonal neurobiology to see if we could apply it to the Enneagram. And we tried it one way and then tried another way, tried another way. David and I are both therapists who were working with clients to try it out. And
Mm-hmm.
then we came upon um, some work by someone who was writing in the field called affective neuroscience,
Mm-hmm.
Jock Pinkstead. And Jock had written his last two books in our series, and we found it was illuminating of what the Enneagram might actually be all about.
Right.
So then we developed a developmental model that we think is accurate,
Mm-hmm.
but time will tell when we do research. But clinically,
Mm-hmm.
the model works beautifully. So
Wow.
I've worked with it now for many, many years. We published it first in 2010
Mm-hmm.
in a chapter on traits that in a book I wrote called The Mindful Therapist. And since then, there's been a lot of application of it, in workshops now and in clinical settings. So the model is really interesting. It basically says that if your attachment's been non-secure,
Mm-hmm.
in whatever variety, that could be avoidance, it could be ambivalence, it could be disorganization, it will intensify basically a temperament's drive to personality that you would have had anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but it intensifies that particular pattern. And we believe that pattern is based on three fundamental needs that you have, and then how those three fundamental needs in turn are divided into another three based on where your energy seems to go. So
Mm-hmm.
some people have energy that starts inward, inside of them. Some people
Mm-hmm.
have energy that starts outside of them. Some people have energy that kind of shimmers inside, outside, inside, outside.
Hmm.
And those
Wait, wait,
three,
wait, wait. Just say a little bit. What are we talking about right now? Energy that starts inside, outside, or in the middle?
well, attention is the process that directs energy flow,
Mm-hmm.
basically.
Mm-hmm.
So, if some human beings, I don't know if you've noticed this, but some people seem to be very outside people.
Yeah, like
Their energy,
extroverts, it,
no,
or just kind of.
extroverted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so extroversion would relate to your sociability. How
Yeah,
social are
yeah,
you? I
got
mentioned
it.
this
Okay,
is this is more like a person walks into a forest.
okay,
Let's say there's no
okay.
other humans around.
They're
E-
taking information from the environment is how they're
From the
organized,
environment,
as
their
opposed
attention is
to. Okay,
outward.
got it. Yeah,
Exactly. And other people are more like, I'll try to do it here, like
yeah.
inward. They're more like
Understand.
saying, what's going on inside of me? Not doesn't have to do with how sociable you are.
Okay. Thank you. I wanted to make sure I understood what you were talking
Yeah.
about. That makes sense.
And then some people have this interesting blend of inward and outward,
Uh
inward
huh.
and outward. The tension between those two is not really just adding them up. It's, we use this word dyadic for when
Mm-hmm.
something's paired up. And in fact, there was a birthday party right before the final version of this book was turned in. I have a big doubting pattern of my personality. I went out to lunch with a good friend who's a brain scientist, and I said, I'm so worried we've hypothesized this aspect of temperament that's about a tendency,
Mm.
tendency of attention to be either inward, outward, or both, this dyadic shimmering. And she goes, what are you talking about? And I repeated myself several times. She goes,
Mm.
don't you know I did a study 10 years ago that showed in the brain some people are inward, some people are outward. And she said it before I even said it to her. And some people have this weird shimmering inward and outward. So
So
Mary
shimmering is
Helen,
the technical term for this, is what you're
yeah,
saying. That's great. Okay.
yeah, we just call it dyadic. That's dyadic tension kind of between the two. Anyway, so Mary Helen Immordino Yang
Uh
had
huh.
found that in the brain years before we proposed it, but we weren't aware of her. Actually, no, she found it in 2013, so we proposed it in 2010. But anyway, we didn't know about her work, and she didn't know about ours. So that was an independent finding. We call it consilience. The bottom line of that is if you take these three aspects of what we think are temperament, inward, outward, or dyadic, and place them on top of these three fundamental motivational networks beneath the cortex, agency, bonding, certainty, then you get nine different patterns that basically explain the entire Enneagram
Mm.
system. So we
Amazing.
presented it to the International Enneagram Association. They thought they were going to be really we thought they were going to be angry with us. They loved it. Russ Hudson, who's in the other major school besides the narrative Enneagram of Helen Palmer and David Daniels, he loved it. You should have been on the Zoom call with Russ. I mean, it was beautiful, and he wrote this gorgeous endorsement of the book. So it was an incredible moment because there is no comprehensive neuroscience developmental perspective that you can use in therapy of
Right.
the Enneagram. And then when we were writing the book up, after our dear colleague David passed in 2017, so it's been a long, many, many years project to write this book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what we found, which was kind of amazing, was that, and I'll ask you about this, Dr. Bobby, when you were trained as a therapist, did someone teach you specifically how to use personality? And I don't mean personality disorder, how to use personality in the process of psychotherapy?
No, absolutely not. And I will tell you actually that as part of my professional background, one of the things that I have done over the years is, in addition to all of the traditional things, have actually pursued coaching psychology for use with my clients who tend to be higher functioning. They want to grow, make positive changes, because through that model, I think there is a much more explicit system of talking about values, motivations, what's important to you, what is your why, how are you oriented towards the world. Whereas that psychotherapy is really just that diagnosis and treatment of mental health conditions that doesn't really account for those internal differences in the same way. And even with personality testing, a lot of that was really focused on identifying problematic personalities, that
Exactly.
psychopathology piece. So, yeah, I totally get what you're
Exactly.
saying. And that's why I think I've used the Enneagram with my clients in practice, is because it offers a system for bringing that into the conversation in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Bobby, you are not alone. I've asked
Yeah.
now hundreds and hundreds of therapists, and it's usually, 99% or more
Yeah.
say they've never been told anything about how to work with personality in therapy. So as we're writing the book, I was kind of shocked about this. I didn't learn anything about it, but I thought that's
Right.
just because I'm a psychiatrist and we have maybe a limited understanding. Then I was talking to all these other disciplines in the field of mental health. So this became just another thing about the book was, okay, well, this isn't all of personality, but it's a part of it anyway, maybe a big part, maybe a small part, but it looks deeply at this really interesting question, which I find interesting as a therapist. What is temperament in our patients, and what are the adaptive strategies that people have learned to deal with that temperament? And then what is the attachment stance, which is the strategies that emerged when you were a kid learning to try to achieve this sense of connection with your attachment figures.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
okay. And so then for our listeners, therapists who are interested in learning more, maybe applying it into their work. So the Enneagram basically says that humans come in about 9 primary flavors, and that your work goes into, why might that be? But I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about how you and your colleagues have come to understand the impact of attachment style on the way these different personalities and temperaments are expressed.
Yeah. So let me say just a couple of things. Number
Sure.
one, um, our initial goal was to give a developmental neuroscience view of the Enneagram,
Yeah.
and we think it is a good starting place for that. But then research that has come up since then, independent of the Enneagram, points to very similar foundations that I'll describe in a moment, suggesting that actually the PDP view, the patterns of developmental pathways, PDP is what we call this, may actually be somewhat, um, how can I say this, somewhat user friendly, user friendly in a way that you don't need to draw on the Enneagram. So it does explain the Enneagram, but since other theoretical work has come out now looking at the overall field of personality theory and looking at motivation and looking at behaviors, that's you know in very many ways resonant with the PDP view. What that suggests is that the Enneagram may be actually just one way of describing
Got it.
how temperament pushes upward
Yeah.
into personality. So, what I'll
Hmm.
describe, and my colleagues have insisted we say this when we ever get into a lot of details, is my particular view of this matter. We wrote a book together, and that's fine. And now we're all doing our individual things, which is great. So, what I'm going to say now is really my perspective, which is that you know the patterns of developmental pathways proposes that there are three fundamental needs we have that we can describe as agency, bonding, and certainty that you can remember with ABC.
Hmm.
And that these three needs are activated after you're born and you've departed from the in utero, in the womb
Hmm.
experience of
Hmm.
basically being effortless being, where you have this experience that's embedded into implicit memory that gives you a sense of wholeness.
Hmm.
That once you're born, if you don't breathe, or if you don't have connections, or if you
Yeah.
don't have your body needs met, you're going to unfortunately die. So it's
Right.
a do or die situation. And that contrast of the working for a living in this do or die situation after birth and the state of effortless being in the womb that you embed in implicit memory, meaning your body sensations, your
Hmm.
perceptions, your emotions. It gives you even a behavioral repertoire of just effortless being. And in that implicit memory,
Hmm.
you're going to have an experience of familiarity with that, even though pure implicit memory, when it's retrieved, doesn't have a feeling like I'm remembering anything.
Right.
So, what I think happens, and this is what we propose, and you may not ascribe to this developmental view, and you don't even need it for the PDP model to work. But what we think happens is one of those networks beneath the cortex that Jock Panksepp beautifully writes about, agency, bonding, certainty, is a little more sensitive than another one
Mm.
in many of us. And after a week of life, a month of life, 2 months, 6 months of life, what is just an initial small sensitivity, more intensity, will have more neural firing.
Hmm.
And once that sensitive, more intensely responding area is actively firing, it is actually going to grow in more intense ways
Hmm.
than other networks. So by a year of age, you're going to have this increase
Hmm.
dominance of this particular network. So we think that's why, for many of us, not all of us, one of these networks will become more dominant.
Hmm.
Then, whether you're inward, outward, or dyadic, in both
Got
inward and
it.
outward, in this kind of shimmering tension,
Mm.
will really shift how you experience agency. So that
Hmm.
if we go through just with that one grouping,
Yeah.
if you look at some of those agency outward,
Right.
their adaptive strategies to dealing with that, I need to have my bodily needs met.
Mm.
I need to have this sense of competence. I need to be a center of initiative. When my energy's outward, I'm looking in the world of how to express myself, how to
Mm.
get my needs met.
Hmm.
And I'm this very present, you
Yeah.
know, being. And kids that are like that, right? And you have
Hmm.
clients
That
like that.
that challenger personality, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we acknowledge that the research is really clear. There's no such thing as a personality type.
Mm.
Their personality patterns. And it's
Patterns.
important to draw the distinction. A
Yeah.
pattern is a
Hmm.
range of values that have all sorts of variations to them and that can change over time. A
Right.
type kind of fixes you in more like a noun like
Got
thing.
it.
So that's
Yeah.
why we want to remove the word type from our vocabulary if we can. It's
Mm.
hard to do because it's so built into things.
Hmm.
But in working with academics in this area, they say, Dan, whatever you do, just don't use the concept of type. And
That's
we
such
agree
a
with that.
helpful reminder, I think, for everybody listening that let's not box people into weird little categories. That,
Exactly.
yeah. Uh
Yeah,
huh.
so you can
Yeah.
say it's a pattern. So we would call this a directing pattern, or I call it that anyway. But then if you're inward, just to use this as, excuse me,
Hmm.
an example, if you're inward, so now I'm used to be in the womb, now I'm out of the womb,
Hmm.
and now I have this agency as my particularly sensitive vector, meaning I have
Hmm.
to be the center of action, but I have all this inward awareness that I'm no longer having all my needs met in the womb.
Hmm.
I've got to basically develop this mapping pattern where I
Mm,
map out how things should be. So at least when I go out into the world, I'm coming prepared with this
mm,
internal map, like things should be like that, and they should be like this, or
mm,
be like
mhm,
that.
mhm.
And if I'm mapping, then I feel as close to wholeness as I can get.
Got it.
So for me, if I've had non-secure attachment, that could be super intense. And I
Right.
become really dominant in just trying to control things and make
Yeah.
people do what I think they should be doing and I should on myself. And I'm just
Mhm,
all tense and I have irritation,
mhm,
frustration, anger, sometimes even rage. But if I have secure attachment or I've been working on my own self development, my inner development, then I relax these mapping patterns. And then what was, a low functioning, low integrated is what we call it state.
mhm.
Then I realize I have a lot of gifts because if I'm working on a project or we're going on a camping trip together, I'm going to have this comprehensive view of what are the equipment,
Mhm.
what is the list of equipment that we need, what
Yeah.
are all the details that I will attend to? And I will make sure I've got all the details down. And you want me on your camping trip because I'm going to have something really positive to offer. The same thing with the directing pattern,
Mhm.
the agency outward. You
Yeah.
want them on the camping pattern if they're in the
Absolutely.
higher integrated mode. If they're not,
Mhm.
they're just going to be bossy and
Yeah.
in your face and not very collaborative. But if they're high integrated, they bring all this energy and exuberance
Yeah.
to getting stuff done, and
I hear
standing up for
you.
what's right. Now
Okay.
the
So,
middle one, but
mhm.
let's do the middle one because this is where you
Okay.
see the whole model becomes fascinating.
Okay.
When you have a dyadic attendancy and you're in this agency vector, so we call it agency D for dyadic, then it's a fascinating observation in the narratives because we've had 50,000 narratives we were working with.
Hmm.
The narratives basically show that if you're in this grouping, your adaptive strategy to your own temperament is you're no longer in the womb. You have this inner sense of, my gosh, I'm aware that I need to be making things right, making
Mhm.
things get embodied empowerment, have it happen. But I'm outwardly aware of what the problems can be. So what I do is I become a harmonizing pattern adaptive
Mm.
strategy where I just want to make everyone get along.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, on the downside of that is I'm not even aware of what I need.
Mm.
Because if I say to you, Lisa, hey, you say to me, Dan, where do you want to go to dinner? And I go, I don't care. Because if
Yeah.
I cared and I said, let's go for Italian food, well, what if you wanted Thai food?
Right.
There's going to be a conflict. Is it you or me? So I just avoid that by basically disappearing.
Oh.
So I had a really close friend. I had a really close friend in this pattern. When we
Mhm.
went over this PDP view, his whole life made sense. His whole life was about how to lose his inner life so he could avoid conflict.
Mhm.
Now that's with the downside, but when you realize this in a positive way, you want that person on the camping trip because if
Right.
there's a conflict, they're going to mediate and be a peacemaker, bring
Mhm.
harmony to the whole camping experience, but they don't have to lose themselves to do that.
Yeah.
So, we can go through the other six if you want, but the thing that's so exciting about it is you can see as a therapist then, and I was recently presenting this in London, and
Mhm.
Bessel van der Kolk was there, and Dick Schwartz was there. We were living together in London for a
Mm.
little bit of time. And so Bessel van der Kolk said to me, this is really helpful for trauma because you can see, ultimately trauma
Mhm.
being one aspect of non-secure attachment,
Sure.
developmental trauma. You can see that trauma can affect us in 9 different ways, not just one way, and that your own experience, as Dick Schwartz, who was also there, of your different aspects of yourself, what Dick calls parts, whether they're protective parts as
Mhm.
firefighters or managers, or even the exile parts, can manifest themselves through these different,
Right.
patterns of personality. Then
Mhm.
you begin to get, as a therapist, this incredible vision of how to help your clients in a very effective way.
Yeah. Well, and I love this too because, Dick Schwartz and internal family systems, it's really another way of understanding which aspect of personality, of temperament is kind of driving the show, and how that is expressed, again, depending on a healthy manifestation of that versus one that has been influenced by adverse childhood experiences. And it really ties in all of these different ways of thinking about people in terms of strengths, personality, the impact of trauma, how parts of self can work together. And I just, this is so interesting. So I personally am very eager to read this new book of yours. And so,
Here it is.
oh, there it is. Personality and wholeness in therapy. I love this. And so, because
There's this
we're,
stuff, yeah.
oh, wait, I'm not sure that I could read. You'll have to read it out loud to us because I don't think
So
that I could see it on
integrating
my screen.
9 patterns of developmental pathways
Okay,
in clinical practice.
good deal.
There you go.
Well, and so I know that in this book you go into how to use the system, and it's for therapists, how to use the system in order to understand their clients or their patients differently, and how to really tailor this healing and growth experience through the lens of these personality tendencies. We're not using the word types, temperament
Patterns, yeah.
patterns, right? And I know that we don't have a ton of time together, so I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how therapists can learn more, certainly, about the book. And then I know that in addition to your research and publishing for parents, for civilians, you also do a lot of training for clinicians. And so let's talk about where a clinician can go to learn more about these new ideas of yours and how to apply them in their work.
Sure. Well, the Mindsight Institute would
Okay.
be the best place to go, mindsightinstitute.com for courses. We have an extensive training program for clinicians in interpersonal neurobiology.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll be developing more in this personality framework soon. But there's other courses. There's courses on consciousness and integration and all sorts of things you'll find there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the best way to learn as a therapist. In this book, what you'll find is there are lots of clinical examples that I put
Mm-hmm.
in there from my own practice and from David Daniels' practice, who is a co-author of the book. And what's exciting about this is that it also gives you an overarching stance to take as a therapist of how to tease apart what is temperament, what are the adaptive strategies of temperament that merge forward into personality, then how does attachment then bring that when it's secure into the optimal integrative, high strengths of that
Mm-hmm.
personality pattern? How does non-secure attachment instead move that same personality pattern towards the low integrated states of that particular pattern,
Right.
so that then you can have a feelings like the serenity prayer, to figure out what is actually changeable, what do you accept as not fundamentally changeable, and then how can you know the difference, so you give the courage in many ways for yourself as a therapist and your
Mm-hmm.
client to explore the growth edges that allow people to really develop and change. It
Mm-hmm.
may be ultimately that personality is kind of like a filter through which we, see these needs of agency, bonding, and certainty. And what Carol Dweck beautifully writes about in a resident paper, which
Mm-hmm.
is about you have these combined needs for esteem, the sense of worth inside yourself and social
Right.
status, trust, and control, and even for the idea of coherence. And when you look at all of that under the term
Mm-hmm.
wholeness,
Right.
uh, for us, it makes total sense, not only from these narratives we were deriving this from, but as a therapist using this for many years now, you can really see that we are each on a journey toward wholeness, toward trying to achieve a sense of being at peace, feeling connected, feeling, that we're having our fundamental needs met. And that's
Mm-hmm.
for every human on the planet. So this is what I love about the PDP framework is it gives you as a therapist a way to empower your clients without it being a pathology model,
Mm-hmm.
and it allows you to see how attachment interacts with temperament in creating with security these high functioning states, or non-security these vulnerable states
Mm-hmm.
that are revealed. And then once you get familiar with it, it becomes not only useful, it actually becomes fun to explore, because there's dimensions of it we're not getting into, which is modes of expressing emotion and the areas in your body that you tend to feel, at first when you get activated, that really help you understand, for example, how this affects a person's individual experience and how it affects their interpersonal relationships. And so I've just come off of a month of doing intense workshops, which were so rewarding
Mm.
to have people do a deep dive in this clinical model and see how to use it in their personal and professional lives.
Wow. Okay, now I'm jealous. I want to come to one of your workshops because this is fascinating. And so the new book, Personality and Wholeness in Therapy.
Well, you can get it wherever books are sold.
Mm-hmm.
You try out, your
Okay.
independent booksellers. You could be at your local
Yeah. To
bookstore and even from
pre-order it on
Norton.
Amazon.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Excellent.
Hmm.
Wonderful. Okay, well, and then you'll also have to stay in touch with me and my community. I tell us when you have more workshops coming up because I have so many people in my network who would be very interested in learning
Great.
more about the system. Yeah.
Well, we have some. If you go to my website, you'll see we have a number of events that are going to happen publicly around the book's release.
Okay.
So those would be things you can hop on, and then we're just starting to think about if people are interested these days in coming in person for a
Hmm.
workshop, or if we're going to do it
Yeah.
on online. We're trying to figure out what's most useful for people to do.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
We'll all stay tuned because this is really these are none of the components of the ideas are new necessarily, and the way that you are combining them and using these old ideas to understand human beings and how they operate in different ways are really new. And I think that there's going to be just a ton of interest and that will be a very, very useful tool. So anyway, I'm so grateful to have spent this time with you today, learning about it and talking about it. And thank you again so much for being here. Love, happiness, and success for therapists.
thank you, Dr. Bobby. A pleasure and great to see you today.
Thank you.